A true feeling story about the Sunday that changed everything. If you grew up in a small American town in the early 1940s, you might remember how Sundays always felt the same. Quiet. Predictable. Sacred in their stillness. People moved slow. Shops were closed. Radios were turned down low. And after church, families sat around big oak tables passing mashed potatoes like it was their only job in the world. I was 13 that Sunday. And I still remember exactly what I was wearing. A blue dress with a missing button near the waist and a small stain on the sleeve I hoped no one would notice. I had just finished helping Mama dry the dishes when I heard it. The radio was on in the front room, soft as usual, just background company while Papa read the paper and my little brother rolled marbles across the rug. But then the announcer's voice changed. It wasn't loud. But it cracked. Like something inside him had just broken. We interrupt this program to bring you a special bulletin. And then it happened. Words we didn't understand. Names we'd never heard. And one phrase that would become a shadow in every American home. Pearl Harbor has been attacked. Papa turned the dial like maybe it would change the story. Mama stopped wiping her hands. Even my little brother stood still, marble clutched in his palm. The room was suddenly colder. That night, the lights went out. Not because of a storm. Not because of some power line accident. But because the government ordered it. Blackout drills, they called them. We taped the windows. Hung heavy blankets over every crack. Even the tiniest glow from a single lamp was considered dangerous. They said we had to be ready. That we were all part of it now. I didn't fully understand what war meant. Not yet. But I knew something had changed. Because for the first time in my life, the light in our hallway stayed off. And Mama didn't sing while she folded laundry. The next morning at school, nobody talked about math or spelling. We all just watched the teacher's face. She looked like someone who hadn't slept. Like she'd aged 5 years overnight. Some of you may have family in Hawaii, she said gently. If you need to step outside, just raise your hand. Nobody moved. We were just kids, barely old enough to understand the world. Now being asked to carry a piece of its weight. In the days that followed, everything became sharper. The sound of church bells. The click of Mama's sewing needle. The snap of envelopes opening with shaky fingers. And the radio, oh, the radio. It became a heartbeat in every home. Each night, we sat in silence while Papa turned the knob just so. Tuning in to reports, voices from Washington, London, the Pacific. I didn't know where Pearl Harbor was. But I knew it lived in my house now. And it changed the way we breathed. Mama started keeping a box by the door labeled, "For the boys." She filled it with socks, canned goods, chocolate, and small handwritten notes she never let me read. They need to know someone's thinking of them, she'd say. I began adding my own things. A smooth stone I'd found by the creek. A drawing of our house. A folded paper star. I didn't know who would open that box. But I wanted them to feel something warm when they did. People in town changed too. Mr. Henderson from the barbershop stopped charging widows for haircuts. The Thompsons gave up one of their bedrooms to a military family passing through. Even the kids, us, started watching the skies like it meant something. And maybe it did. Because when the world feels like it's unraveling, you cling to anything that feels familiar. Even if it's just the sound of a marble rolling across the floor. One night, a siren went off. Not loud, just long and low, like a warning whispered through the trees. Papa turned off the radio. Mama closed the curtains tighter. I sat by the window and watched the stars, wondering how something so far away could feel so close. That's when I realized the war had already arrived. Not with bombs, but with silence. After the lights went out, nothing ever quite looked the same. Even in the daylight, people in town moved a little slower, like they were listening for something. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was news. Or maybe we were all just trying to hear each other more clearly. Since the silence had grown so loud, our school days changed. Not in the ways you'd see on paper, but in the little things. We started having air raid drills every week. The first time it happened, we didn't even know what it was. A siren rang from the fire station, and our teacher, Miss Adler, stood up with a kind of urgency I'd never seen in her. Under the desks. Now. Some kids laughed at first. Then someone asked, "Why?" She didn't answer. Her lips were pressed tight like she was holding something back. Her hands shook a little as she pulled the blackout curtain down over the windows. From that day on, we practiced drills like they were part of math class. At home, Papa started reading the newspaper differently. Not quickly, like he used to, just skimming headlines while sipping coffee. Now he read every word. Every name. He folded and refolded pages with care. Marked things. Underlined dates. Circled troop movements. Mama began knitting more, scarves, hats, mittens. And mailing them in brown paper boxes to places we'd never been but suddenly felt connected to: New Jersey, California, England. Every stitch is a prayer, she'd say. I started keeping my own list. Every boy from our street who'd joined up. By Christmas, there were 5 names. By Easter, there were 9. One of them was Caleb Brooks. He was 17. Tall, polite, with a voice that always sounded like it was about to laugh. He worked at the pharmacy on weekends and carried groceries for the older ladies even when they didn't ask. He left town wearing a uniform that didn't quite fit yet. I remember waving as he rode off on the train. A few weeks later, his mother came into our store. She stood in front of the counter holding a bag of flour, but she didn't say a word. Her eyes looked past everything. That spring, I started writing in a notebook I hid under my bed. Not a diary, exactly, just pages of feelings I didn't know where else to put. One entry read: "Today I saw a bird building a nest in the gutter of the school." It made more sense than most of the adults I know. Another: "I think Mama cries sometimes in the pantry. She never says, but her eyes are pink when she comes out." And one that I still remember best: "I used to think the world was our house, school, and church. Now it's something that can break, and we have to pretend it's not." We started collecting metal scraps for the war effort. Even kids. Cans, tools, bent nails, broken hinges. Every bit mattered. The local paper ran photos of children standing beside piles of junk like they were trophies. One boy even gave up his bicycle. I didn't want to give mine, but I gave the bell. Papa said, "You didn't give up your bike. You gave someone else a way to come home." Summer came, but it didn't feel like summer. The usual carnival didn't happen. The swimming hole wasn't as crowded. And when fireworks were canceled for the 4th of July, people lit candles on porches instead. Some said it was beautiful. Others said it felt like mourning. Mama and Papa tried to keep things normal. We still had Sunday dinners. Still said grace. Still listened to the radio at night. But something had shifted. Like childhood was a sweater I'd outgrown overnight. One night, the power went out, not a drill, just a storm. I sat on the floor near the front window, watching lightning scratch the sky. Papa lit a kerosene lamp and placed it in the middle of the room. The light flickered across the walls and made everything look softer. Older. Like we were in someone else's memory. He sat down beside me, looked out the window, and said, "Sometimes I wonder what kind of world you'll remember." I didn't know how to answer. But I reached for his hand. And in that moment, I think we both hoped it would be one with less silence. And more light. School resumed that fall. The blackboard still had leftover math problems from May. But the kids were different. Even the troublemakers were quieter. Miss Adler began reading aloud to us after lunch, stories about places we'd never see. One day, she read a poem about a soldier who wrote letters he never sent. No one made a sound. Even the air felt still. After class, I asked her if she'd ever known someone who didn't come back. She looked down and nodded. "Yes," she said. "And someone who did, but never really came home." By Christmas of 1942, we had 12 names on our list. One boy's name was crossed out with a black pen. I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. Mama hung a star in the window, blue at first. Later, red. Then gold. She didn't explain the colors. But I understood them all the same. And even now, after all these years, when I see candlelight flicker, or hear the static of an old radio dial, or feel that silence that settles in right before someone says something they can't take back, I remember what it was like to be 13. In a house full of blankets taped over windows. Holding a pencil in one hand and a question in the other. Will things ever feel normal again? A quiet ending to a young girl's wartime memories. By the spring of 1943, the world had become a place of shadows and headlines. The radio still played every night, but it felt heavier now. Like the voices inside knew they were delivering more than news. They were delivering weight. Names. Numbers. Cities I couldn't pronounce, and places I'd only ever seen in the folds of my father's war maps. I learned more geography from wartime radio than I ever did at school. Papa stopped reading aloud from the paper. He just sat with it, folded in his hands, unmoving. The ink would leave faint smudges on his fingers, and sometimes I'd catch him staring at them like they were bruises. Mama started putting less sugar in the tea. Not because we couldn't afford it, but because she was saving it, for someone else, somewhere far away. And I grew up. Not all at once. Not in any way someone would notice from the outside. But in small ways. In quiet ways. I stopped expecting birthdays to feel like birthdays. Stopped waiting for summer to smell like lilacs and lemonade. Stopped wishing things would go back. Instead, I started hoping they would just move forward, without too much more breaking. One Saturday, I walked into town alone. It had rained that morning, and the streets were still damp. Shop windows fogged slightly, and there was a smell of iron in the air, like wet tools and new soil. I passed the shoe store, the post office, the barber shop. All familiar. All smaller than they used to feel. Outside the bakery, I saw Mrs. Callahan pinning something to the community board. It was a small piece of paper, barely bigger than a postcard. Written in careful, slanted handwriting were the words. My son is coming home. Not walking, but still coming. She pinned it with 2 thumbtacks and walked away. I stood there a long time. That week, Mama asked me to take down the blackout curtains. "We can leave the windows bare now," she said. "They say the threat is farther away." But when I peeled the tape off the window frames, I found lines in the paint. Permanent shadows from the war. "You can take the blankets down. But the outline of where they were, that stays." Papa began working again in the garden. Digging deeper this year. Clearing the corners. Talking to the soil like it was something he trusted more than the radio. "We'll grow beans, and we'll grow tomatoes, and we'll feed whoever's hungry." That was his victory speech. No parade. Just a shovel and some seeds. At church, there were new faces. Young men in uniform, standing beside parents who looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen them. Some boys didn't return. Their names were carved into a plaque near the altar. I ran my finger across them once and whispered each one under my breath, like a spell to keep them from fading. And then, one evening in August, just as the sun was starting to slip behind the trees, we heard it. "Japan has surrendered." I thought the town would erupt. But it didn't. We lit the porch light. Mama brought out lemonade. Papa sat on the steps with his radio in his lap, like he didn't quite believe it yet. Across the street, Mr. Rosen wept into his hands. And I just stood in the middle of the yard, arms by my side, looking up at the sky that was too quiet for what had just happened. It was over. And yet, it wasn't. Because the world that came after didn't feel the same as the one before. It was softer, maybe. Or maybe we were just more careful with it. Years passed. And I grew. Left home. Had children. Lived a life filled with both ordinary things and extraordinary love. But I never forgot that first night the lights went out. Or the way my papa held my hand tighter than usual. Or how Mama's voice trembled just a little when she said grace. Even now, when I hear static on an old radio, or see candlelight flicker across a window, or smell paper that's been folded too long, I remember being 13. In a town that turned its lights off, but never turned its heart off. Candle, that was my childhood. And that was the night we learned. Sometimes darkness brings us closer to the light. L. Grace Holloway. Wright County, Iowa, 1941 to 1945.